pizza, pasta, Ferrari, the most challenging opening against the first move e4. Do you know what all of these things have in common? They're all Italian, and I'm here to present you with my 4-night Sicilian repertoire.
So how do we play chess like a proper capomandamento, which means the mafia boss in Italian? We meet the move e4 with the move c5, stopping white from playing d4 and having the ideal pawn center. So it accomplishes basically the same thing as the move e5, however c5 is much more imbalanced. Now white typically plays the move knight f3, developing the kingside knight, planning to castle short at some point. This is what you're going to see the most in your games. However, we still have a really good recipe against the move knight f3. We just simply want to play the move e6. Now the idea of the move e6 is that at some point we might want to play the move d5, grab more space in the center. Also, it would be nice to open up the diagonal for our bishop. And now what should I do? Well, one move that I want to cover is the move d4, which is the main line. But first of all, I would like to have a look at the move bishop c4, which is one of the most common mistakes below 1500. And I'm just asking myself why. Why would you put the bishop here? It makes sense when black already put the pawn on e5, so the diagonal is open. But now we've already created this pawn chain, and this bishop is just shooting into this pawn chain, basically doing absolutely nothing. So what should we do in this position? Well, there is an easy way of how to take an advantage of the move bishop c4. Just play the move d5, hit the bishop. The pawn is protected. That's basically what we've prepared by playing the move e6 earlier on. And now if white takes, we just simply recapture with our e-pawn, again hitting the bishop. What should white do? White has to lose a tempo, right? If white goes bishop b5 in this position, we just simply block this check with a bishop with this move. And then we can just simply develop the rest of our pieces and castle short. We have these two really strong pawns in the center. We already have better position because white lost that one tempo by moving bishop to c4 first and then to b5, which accomplished absolutely nothing. And we are never worried about this exchange because whenever white exchanges, now this doubled pawn means absolutely nothing for white. I mean, it means a lot of bad things. First of all, we have a bishop pair. Second of all, our center is actually better because the pawn on c6 is reinforcing the pawn on d5, and also the absence of the pawn on the b file is opening up the b file for the rook. So there is no reason why to play something like this. Now in this position we just want to develop our pieces to their ideal squares. So let's say knight f6, bishop d6, bishop g4, short castle. And then, well, we have more space, we have more aggressive position. What else do we want? White is already worse. Okay, so we're back in this position. We talked about the move bishop c4, that is not great. Let's have a look at the move d4. This is the most common move in this position. It is called open Sicilian. It is the most logical move as well. It's grabbing a lot of space in the center, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, challenging the pawn on c5. Well, makes absolute sense. How are we going to handle this move? Well, we always want to take. That is applicable for any kind of Sicilian. We always want to take on d4. We never want to let our opponent to push that pawn forward. So now once we take, our opponent can recapture with the knight or with the queen. If our opponent recaptures with the queen, we are more than happy because we'll play knight c6, hitting the queen on d4, winning a tempo on it. So that doesn't make much sense. That's just making the position worse. So let's say white takes with the knight. That is the most common move, makes the most sense. Now we don't really have any way of how to win a tempo on the knight, but we don't really mind it because we are going to play the move knight f6 with a tempo. Now we are hitting the pawn on e4, and some of you might be asking, well, what happens if white goes e5, right? What happens if white goes e5? Grabbing the space, hitting the knight, seems a bit annoying. Well, we are going to play queen a5 check. Vamos! Winning the pawn on e5. Winning the center pawn, we are already better. This is great. We are more than happy if white plays this kind of line, because then we are better. So let's go back. Let's say white is not stupid. It's not going to play the move e5. What else can white do? Well, the most logical move in this position is the move knight c3. Just simply protecting the pawn with the knight. And now we are going to develop the remaining knight. So we are going to move the knight to c6. And now you probably finally understand why is this line called the 4-knight Sicilian. Well, now the question is, what should white do now? I would start with the move bishop d3. That's not a great move at all. You will be surprised by how many players will make this mistake against you. You just simply take the knight. Yeah, so bishop d3 does not work at all. Well, there are many moves that we will go over one by one. However, I would say that most of the time you want to meet your opponent's move with the move bishop e4. Whether your opponent goes bishop e3, f3, bishop e2, knight to b5. You almost always want to play the move bishop e4. Yeah, the only two moves where that you don't want to meet with the move bishop e4 are a3 and knight takes c6. Then you would probably lose some material. But unless your opponent plays a3 or knight c6, you are going to meet every single move with the move bishop e4, which is making everything much simpler for us. Well, I would like to start with the move bishop e3 in this position, which is one of the most common moves, most logical moves, right? Just developing the bishop. It is also one of the most common moves against other types of Sicilian, such as the dragon or the knight dwarf. You know, White typically wants to play the same setup against different types of Sicilian to make it a little bit easier to remember all the lines. But that's exactly why the 4-knight Sicilian is so good. Because whenever you play logical moves that you can play in other types of Sicilian, you end up in a worse position. And I know it sounds so weird, but it's exactly how it works. The most dangerous lines against the 4-knight Sicilian are lines that you can't play against any other type of Sicilian. And that's exactly what is making the 4-knight Sicilian so nice. So now we're just simply going to play bishop e4. We always want to meet any kind of move in this position with the move bishop e4. And now we are pinning the knight on c3 and putting pressure on the pawn on e4. So we're already asking concrete questions. And the question is, what is White going to do about it? So White has two different ways of how to protect the pawn on e4. One of them is f3 and the other one is bishop d3. I would like to start with the move bishop d3, just to start with the slightly better line. However, both of these lines are going to be super similar. So once we accomplished this kind of ideal setup when we are putting pressure on the pawn on e4, what we want to do is to actually put even more pressure on the pawn on e4 and play the move d5. This is a beautiful move because now we are attacking the pawn on e4 once again, and it is quite difficult for White to handle this threat. Well, one of the ways how can White meet this d takes e4 or knight takes e4 threat is to take on d5. But that's not really ideal, because then we're simply going to take with our knight, hitting the knight on c3, putting some pressure on the bishop on e3, and also this knight is still putting some pressure on the knight on d4. So let's say White played something like bishop d2 to break the pin. We are going to take the knight on e4, and we are already piece up. So this is definitely something that White should avoid. And White needs to play the move knight takes c6. And the knight takes c6 move makes quite a lot of sense. It is quite an effective intermediate move, right? Hitting our queen, taking our knight. So now we have to retake with our pawn. And now in this position, White probably has to play something like bishop d2, because the knight on c3 is still under pressure, so is the bishop on e3. But if White goes bishop d2, then we just simply take. And after bishop takes, b takes, well, this is a good position. We have this 4 v3 at the king side, and White has this 3 v2 at the queen side. But this 3 v2 is literally just 2 v2, because White has an isolated doubled pawn. So that's not really great for White. And we already have slight advantage just because of the pawn structure. And that's, to be absolutely honest with you, the best line White has here. Because let's say White goes bishop d4, then we take on c3. And now if White took with the b pawn instead of the bishop, then we take on d4. This is an amazing move. Look at this pin. Also, we can put some pressure on the rook on the a1, right? So how is White going to handle this position? Well, the only move seems to be c takes b4. And now we have a really precise queen c3. And that's check, right? If White goes queen d2, we take the rook. So White can't play queen d2. And that means that White has to move with the king. And only then we take the pawn. And now White lost the castling right. And White is much worse. We're already pawn up. White can't castle anymore. This is amazing. So as you can see, the bishop takes c3 is really the best move here. But then after we transpose into this position, well, this is super comfortable. So White definitely should not play the bishop e3 in the first place. But, you know, the damage has been already done. So are there any other ways of how can White handle this kind of position? Well, White doesn't have to take on d5. White can also take on c6 first. But then we are always more than happy to retake with a b pawn. And if white, let's say, takes with the e-pawn, then we are more than happy to retake with the c-pawn. And this structure change means that we have two central pawns, versus no central pawns whatsoever. White's pawns on c2 and b2 are nowhere near as important as our central pawns on e6 and d5. We are just simply planning to castle short, bishop e7, perhaps drop the bishop to d6, you know, just to line up the bishops like this, and then we can start rolling over our opponent's position with our pawns in the center. This is simply amazing. So whenever you obtain this kind of structure, you are already much better. So we shouldn't go for the e takes d5, right? At least you should try to keep the pawn on e4, but how can a white achieve that? Well, one way is to play the move e5. However, we still have more pawns in the center, so we are still more than happy to play this position. And what we can do is to play the move knight e7. Slightly annoying move, putting pressure on the pawn on e5. And now white needs to protect the pawn, right? Let's say white goes f4, we go c5. Now after c5, you're threatening to go d4, put pressure on the bishop, put pressure on the knight. Obviously now it would be already fork, so white needs to move away with the bishop, lose another tempo. Then we just planning to castle short, bishop b7, perhaps f6, to open up the position a little bit more because our opponent's king is still stuck in the center. And also get the knight into the game, for example, or maybe perhaps even the queen. So as you can see, if we go back to this position, the bishop e3 is a problem because of bishop b4, pinning the knight, putting pressure on the pawn on e4. And if white goes bishop d3, which is actually the best move in this position, then we go d5. Put even more pressure on the pawn on e4. And the best way of how to handle this position is literally going for this kind of position. That is already better for black. So I know that we covered only the move bishop d3. So let's have a look at the move f3 that I promised you to cover after the move bishop d3. So now we go d5. Put the pressure on the pawn on e4 once again. What should I do? Well, really reminds us of the previous position we talked about, right? The position with the bishop d3. But this is basically just a worse version, just to demonstrate how bad things can turn in this line. Let's say white takes on d5 with the pawn, we take with the knight. Threatening to take on e3, threatening to take on c3. This is already really annoying for white. White once again has to take on c6, intermediate move, the only move in the position. Then we take, and white goes bishop d2. Well, after something like this, we go for the same exchanges as before, but the difference is that the bishop is not on d3 and the pawn is on f3. And while the tempo was not well spent, because as you can see, f3 is just weakening white's king. It's just making it much more difficult to castle, and the bishop would be much more happy on d3. So this is just the worst version. If we go back into this position where white took on d5, well, if white takes on c6 instead of taking on d5, once again, we just recapture inwards. After e takes d5, we recapture inwards once again. Now we have we nothing in the center, so it should probably remind you of the position that we already analyzed with the bishop on d3 and the pawn on f2 instead of the pawn on f3 and bishop on f1. So this is basically just slightly worse version of the same thing. If white goes e5, we just simply go knight e7, put pressure on the pawn on e5. And if white goes f3, f4 in this position, spend in one more tempo and actually playing f4, it is once again just the worst version of the same kind of position. We will simply just play the move c5 once again, put in pressure on the center, preparing to play the move d4, threatening to take the bishop and the knight, so threatening a fork. So, yeah, as you can see, this is basically transposing into just worse versions of the lines with bishop d3 instead of f3. And if white tries to play it independently and just plays bishop d3 here to protect the pawn on e4, we have many different good moves in this position. But I think that the simplest is just to move e5, threatening to take the knight on d4. And now what should white do? Well, if white goes knight e2, d4, boom, game over. Winning a piece because this is a fork. And if white takes on c6, then after b takes c6, the pawn on d5 is protected, so the pawn on c6 is actually reinforced in the center. We are threatening to go d4 with a threat of fork. So, bishop d3 is not great. We just go e5, and the center is just super strong. So, well, as you can see, The bishop e3, bishop e4, f3, bishop d3 are basically almost the same lines. f3 is most of the time worse version of bishop d3. But if white, let's say, played something like bishop e2, we will just simply play the move bishop b4, pin in the knight, put in pressure on the pawn on e4, and after f3, d5. Once again, almost identical line. So, as you can see, no matter whether white starts with bishop e3, bishop e2, or f3, let's say we go bishop e4 once again, the next move is going to be d5. We always respond with the move bishop b4, pin in the knight, put in pressure on the pawn on e4, and then planning to play the move d5. What else can white do except of the lines that we've already seen, bishop e3, bishop e2, f3? Well, one of the moves that we can meet with the move bishop b4 is the move knight takes c6. However, we're quite happy to see this move because we just simply retake with our b-pawn, which is reinforced in the center, and now we are preparing to play the move d5. If white played the move bishop g5 in this position, it would transpose into the line that we will have a look at in a minute. So that would be bishop b4. But if white, let's say, plays something like bishop d3, which seems to be a little bit more natural in this position, what we are going to do is just simply play the move d5. That's exactly the kind of pawn structure we want to have. We've already talked about these structures quite a bit. If white takes, then we retake with our pawn. And, well, this is 2e nothing in the center. This is amazing. And if white goes e5, this is slightly better for white than the previous pawn structure. However, still, we have much better control over the center. We can play knight e7, put the pressure on the pawn on e5. White has to protect it. Now we go c5. Now these two pawns are controlling a lot of center squares. Then we are just simply planning to develop the rest of our pieces and then play f6 and undermine our opponent's pawn chain in the center. Well, this looks really good. These two pawns are super strong. But this actually looks even better. So going back to this position, white can also play the move e5. Put in pressure on the knight with a tempo. Maybe get in an outpost for the knight for some other pieces on d6. But you don't have to be worried. We have a good way of how to play against the move e5. We'll just simply play the move knight d5. Offering the swap off of knights. And if white takes with the knight, we will just simply retake with our c-pawn. And now you don't have to be worried about having a doubled pawn at all, because we can always play the move d6. And after this, we will basically force the exchange of these two pawns. And then we will be left with 2e nothing in the center once again. If white tries to play something like c4 to stop you from playing the move d6, we will just simply take on c4. And after bishop takes, there is a motif that we've already seen. Queen a5 check. And we are going to win the pawn on e5 once again. So, e5 is not that dangerous. You just need to remember that you need to play knight d5. Use this nice outpost for the knight. And if white takes, we don't mind having this doubled pawn because we can always simply play the move d6 and undouble our pawns. And once again, play for the same kind of pawn structure we've already talked about. Now let's have a look at my most favorite line and the main move under 1500. The bishop g5, pin in the knight. Well, as always, we meet this move, or any kind of move in general, with bishop b4, right? Now we are counterpinning our opponent's knight. And now the question is, what is white gonna go for? Well, white needs to act quickly. Because let's say a move like bishop e2, which seems to be really, really logical, is already a big mistake. I absolutely love this queen a5 idea. We are pinning the knight on c3. We are putting pressure on bishop. We are actually threatening to take the bishop. And also, we broke the pin, so we can take on e4. So 3 different threats at the moment. And now, how should white handle this move? Right? If white, for example, goes bishop d2, we immediately win the knight. So whenever white puts a bishop on one of these squares, always keep an eye on the knight on d4, because sometimes it might be hanging. What else can white do? Well, another move is, for example, knight takes c6. Trying to insert an exchange. So then if we take, white will play something like bishop d2. But we don't have to take. We can actually insert a very nice intermediate move. We take on c3 with the bishop, because if we took the bishop right away, the bishop on b4 would be hanging. So we take with a check. And after b takes, I absolutely love the move queen takes g5. You can also take on c3 with a check first, and then your pawn up. But I actually prefer queen takes g5. Because after this move, this knight on c6 is hanging. We are threatening to take on e4, and we also threaten to take on g2. So everything is hanging at the moment. And let's say after something like knight e4, we just simply take on e4. Now we are threatening to take on c3, and then take on e2 and d1. And also we are threatening to take on g2. So white's position is completely falling apart. We are already pawn up, and we are also much more active. So as you can see, bishop e2 is quite a big problem for white. Very surprisingly, because it seems like a very natural move, right? In the next move, white just wants to castle short. Nah, we're gonna go queen a5. We are hitting the bishop, we are hitting the knight, and now we are hitting the pawn as well. because we broke the pawn. So what else can I do? Well, it seems that knight takes c6 can be quite a dangerous move, right? Because if we take with the pawn, now our opponent might be able to play the move e5. However, this is not a big deal. If white doesn't play the move e5, we are still planning to play the move queen a5, putting pressure on the knight that is pinned, also threatening to take the pawn, and also threatening to take the bishop. So it almost seems like white has to play something like e5, right? However, we have a beautiful move here. Queen a5. Let's go. Get in there. Putting pressure on the pawn on e5. Putting pressure on the knight. And also, actually, pinning the pawn. Funnily enough, pinning the pawn. So if white takes on f6 with the pawn, we're just simply going to take the bishop. Now we're threatening to take the pawn on f6, so white probably has to take, but then we retake with our queen. And this is a beautiful position. It might not look like it at the first glance, but we have 2e nothing in the center. Also, we actually have 4 pawns in the center versus 2. And these are not really even central, right? At least these pawns on the C and F file are providing us with some sort of protection for the center one. White doesn't have anything to protect because white doesn't have any center at all. We are also threatening to take on c3. The knight is pinned. And yeah, well, this is a big problem for our opponent. And on the top of that, the bishop on f1 has to keep babysitting the pawn on g2. And can't develop because of queen takes g2. So we can always just simply castle short. Then start rolling over our opponent's center with our pawns. Because, I mean, white doesn't have any opposition, right? So this is a really, really good position. So if we go back, well, does white have anything better? Well, e takes f6 is actually the best move. Because we are threatening to take on c3. We're threatening to take on e5. And if white takes on f6 with the bishop, this is even worse. We can always insert this intermediate move. Bishop takes c3 check. And after b takes, we take with a queen. And now what? If white goes queen d2, the problem is that we are going to take the rook. And if white goes king e2, we're going to go bishop a6 check. It almost seems like a checkmate. The only move white has is to sacrifice the queen. But after sacrificing the queen, we take on d3. And after c takes, we take the rook. Well, this is it. We are absolutely winning. And as you can see, it almost feels like white hasn't made a single mistake. I mean, e5 seems like an almost winning move, right? Because it is putting pressure on the knight on f6. That is pinned, but we have queen a5. And this is fantastic. The best white has is to get into this kind of position where we just put in a lot of pressure on our opponent's position. And well, this is absolutely amazing. And if white goes bishop takes f6, then we have the intermediate bishop takes c3. And after b takes c3, we take with the queen. Another intermediate move with a check. Threatening to take the rook if our opponent blocks with the queen. So, well, this is already absolutely winning. Well, this is it. Black is absolutely winning. And can you think of a single mistake that your opponent made? I mean, white developed the bishop to pin the knight. Now white took on c6 to make the e5 work. Putting pressure on the knight, that is pinned. So far, really logical moves. But after queen a5, we're putting pressure on the pawn on e5, putting pressure on the pawn on c3, pinning the pawn on e5. And after bishop takes f6, bishop takes, b takes, queen takes. Queen d2, queen takes a1, taking the rook. And king e2, bishop a6. Absolutely winning. And it feels like white hasn't made a single mistake. And that's exactly how dangerous this line is. Because even if white plays the logical moves, it might massively fire back.
Alright guys, if you want to keep those knights in action, make sure to share, like, subscribe so you don't miss any of my new videos. I'm preparing plenty of interesting stuff for you. And also, if you're looking for something perhaps a little bit more solid than the Sicilian, you can find my video on Caracan here. Yeah, here. Alright, for now, ciao.